Doesn't, even though we cross measures, we don't have to put in another 5.
Yeah, we don't have to put another 5. Just like here, we don't have to put another 1. In fact, you don't want to. You kind of want to do something that looks uncluttered, you know, that's as straightforward as possible, as clear as possible. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Can you guys see the bottom here? Yeah. If you can, I mean, you can maybe just imagine it. You've also got the sheets in front of you. All right, so again, looking at the whole example, what key would you say we were in? G major, yeah. Even though we don't start on a G harmony necessarily, we definitely end on a G harmony, right? And that's probably more important than the chord you start on. Because you could go 5-1 or something, but still be in a different key. So the key signature of G and the final chord of G tells us that we're in the key of G. And in looking at this, in doing the analysis, again, the harmony changes pretty much every measure. So that's what you want to look for, is measure type stuff. So what's in this first measure here? What kind of harmony do we have for G? 4. 4. Yeah. That's a 4. Now, even though we first get C down here and then we have this, what looks like a second version C chord up here, you don't mark that down in the analysis. Okay, so you would not do 4, 6, 4 there just because of that. Okay. The idea is that, and especially in piano, but this is true a lot of, you know, with that particular figure, you're going to be doing something like this. And you would play it on piano by playing the bass note and using the pedal to sustain that bass note, and then playing the accompaniment above it. So to the ear, that would not change from a root position triad. It would still sound like a root position triad. So when you have any kind of figuration or any kind of way of breaking up the chord, you normally don't analyze those different inversions. You just leave it as whatever the initial bass note was. Now, if you really think it's important to the piece that it changes inversion at some point, that's significant. Or if I was in a different measure, I might say, okay, well, that's probably significant, you know. But normally, just within one measure, you're just going to leave it and assume that that bass note is held over, and so therefore it remains a root position, or whatever inversion it might have started off with. Okay. All right. What about the melody above it? What do we have in terms of non-chord tones? What's a non-chord tone up here?
G, A.
Well, the A is a non-chord tone. Yeah. What else?
D sharp.
The D sharp is a non-chord tone.
Yeah.
The F is a non-chord tone. That's it. Okay, what are we going to call the A?
That's a neighbor tone.
That's a neighbor tone, for sure, right? Because that's a tone that is approached by step and left by step in the opposite direction. That's our definition of neighbor tone. What about the D and the F? Well, the D sharp is a dissonance. It's approached by leap. Okay. It's left by leap. Well, no, actually not, because a partiture is resolved by step. Yeah. But this dissonance is left by leap, and then resolved by step in the opposite direction. But that direction.
Would that be a neighbor group?
Be a neighbor group, yeah. So actually, what I would do is circle both of them and put neighbor group. The neighbor group is the only one we've got where a dissonance is, well, except for the escape tone too, but left by leap.
It has to be a step.
Yeah. The escape tone is approached by step but left by leap. So I was talking about dissonances where they're resolved by leaping away from them. And the neighbor group is one, the escape is another, but they're relatively few that you're on a dissonance and you leave it by leaping away from it. This is one of them. So this D sharp is a dissonance, it's leapt away from. That's unusual. And then the other two notes, the C and the E, or the E and the C, are just part of the harmony. We're good on that. Okay, now, but you know, to actually, you're calling it appoggiatura in an earlier time, Nectarine. This might have been called an appoggiatura. Any dissonance that was approached by leap was called an appoggiatura. But now we have more categorized fancy names for them. So they might just say this is an appoggiatura and this is an appoggiatura. These are just two appoggiaturas. But nowadays, like I say, we have fancier, more categorized names. Okay, what about the next measure? What kind of harmony do we have in the whole measure?
6 going to 1.
No, don't get too picky. Don't get too. Look at the bass part. What is that harmony that's there?
It's just another version of the chords.
Okay, look even. What if it changed harmony? What if we said that it changed harmony?
Oh, I see. Because it's going back to the 1, I guess.
It's going back to the 1, right?
So the harmony, the C and the E are almost acting like a suspension.
Exactly. Okay, so here we have the notes E and C, and E and C are still there. They're sounded together, but they're from the previous chord. And so I would see this as, when the G arrives here, as a return to the 1 chord. And so these two notes are suspensions. They're holding over the harmony, and then they both resolve down by step to their chord tones. And you know, so if you have that in that last measure there, they sound like suspensions. We would think of as suspension. Before the chord before, they're sounded and then. Okay. So that's why you kind of have to look beyond what's happening right there and look at the whole thing, to get the gestalt, the feel of the measure. You know? This measure is really about arriving at 1. And so these are just suspending or holding on to that. Okay, what about the next measure? 5. Yeah, and even, although we haven't gotten there yet, with the note D there, could we call it something else? So if I'm in
Like a 5/7.
G major, yeah, I would call it a 5/7. If I was in G major, this would be the 5 chord, and if I put the C on top, that would be a 5/7. And even though we haven't covered that yet, just take my word for it. We'll get to it next. But this C would indicate a 5/7, so I'm going to call this a root position 5/7, because I think the C is part of the harmony in this measure. Okay, so what non-chord tones do we have in that measure? The E is a non-chord tone. And anything else? No, that's it, right? Everything else, the A, the D, the F sharp, the C, those are all part of the 5/7. So we're all good. So what are we going to call that E?
Seems like the only, if you count the previous chord, it could be an escape. That's definitely.
Yeah, the definition of escape says it's approached by step and left by lead. And this one is definitely left by lead. But it's not approached by step. But then we really don't have a definition for this kind of non-chord tone. There's no non-chord tone on the list, or like if you look in the book, you know, is approached by lead and left by lead. That's very unusual. Remember, everything's like by step, you know, at least something is by step. Usually the resolution, but if not the resolution, then probably the approach to it. I think there's a couple ways we go. Actually, I think we could call it an escape tone of some kind because it's a dissonance that's left by a pretty big leap. We could also call it a appoggiatura because, as I said before, appoggiatura ended up being a kind of generic term for a non-chord tone. Anybody? But since it's on a weak beat, I'm more inclined to call it an escape tone. It's on a weak party beat, so we'll call it an escape tone.
As you get further on and you get into ninths and chords like that, do we start eliminating some of these?
Yeah, I mean, and so if you wanted to say this is a 5-9, you know, and say the E is part of the chord tone, which would also be valid, then what you would do is you would say that's a 5-9, and this is no longer a non-chord tone, right? So when you're doing analysis, make sure that your analysis down here jives with your non-chord tones up here, right? So what you say is the chord down here is going to have to work with whatever you say is not part of the harmony up here. And so if you say this is a ninth, the E is the ninth of that chord. But you know what? In traditional harmony, the dominant ninth is a possible chord, but it's not often used, especially until later on into the romantic era. So it's not something we get heavily into. And any other kind of ninths, you're just not going to see it, because more often than not, you'll be able to account for that ninth as a non-chord tone. And so the question becomes, is it a ninth or is it a non-chord tone? In this case, because it's a dissonance that's approached by leap and left by leap, I'm almost more inclined to call it a ninth. Just because, so then that takes care of that idea of what kind of dissonance is it, you know, what kind of non-chord tone is it. But I think in sticking with traditional harmony, let's call it the seventh, call it an escape, and call it a day. I do have to leave a little bit early, though, just about 5 minutes early.
You're escaping?
I'm escaping, yes. I'm escaping to another meeting. Fun. Okay, so now in this measure here, our fourth full measure, what kind of harmony do we have there? No, we're not going to do that. Again, we're just going to say that when we get there, this is a one chord. Because we have to think of those things as a unit. Remember, each time when we're playing this kind of accompaniment on piano, we're holding down the bass note. So that bass note is still ringing. So we're thinking of that as a unit, just like we did with the C chord. We're not going to analyze, like we wouldn't say 4, 4, 6, 4, 4, 6, 4, 1, 1, 1, 5, 7, 5, 7, 5, 7, 1, 1, 6, 4. No, that's too picky. It doesn't really help us because actually somebody playing this is really just going to go. Right? They're just, and so you're just going to really hear. You're going to hear 4, 1, 4. That's what we're trying to get at with analysis. So when we get here, we're pretty much just landing on a one chord, so the only thing we have to do is explain what are these two things here. Well, I would sort of agree with you, except the C is held over. So that would be the suspension. But the E, well, I guess you could call the E a suspension too. It is heard in there. But it's a non-chord tone there. See, I would call the E like an appoggiatura almost. Again, another a dissonance that comes out of nowhere, in this case, and then is resolved down by steps. So that I would call an appoggiatura. And the C
so going
is
from the
suspension.
C to the CE is what you're
Yeah,
talking about, right?
yeah, that's kind of the way I'm seeing it. Is that this C leaps up to an E, and so therefore, and then is resolved down by step as an appoggiatura.
Oh.
That's the way I would see it. But I think suspension, if you called this a 5-9, that would clear up a lot of those things. You're right, Steve. Because then this would be not a non-chord tone, and I think I'd be more inclined to say, okay, now the E and the C hold over and resolve down by step, and that's a suspension. But it does give you an idea of how there are some gray areas, or sometimes how you call something can affect how you're going to call other parts of that same structure. So there is some fudging that can go on here. But for me, who tends to think in terms of 7th chords and not 9th, 11th, and 13th chords, that would be the way to explain it. Any other questions? Yeah.
I just can't really read it.
Uh-huh.
What did you put there?
So these two notes, I called them two different things. I called the top E an appoggiatura, and the bottom C a suspension.
So between measure 2 and 3, are we doing the same thing there, or since we're coming from the 4, the E carries over?
Yeah, that's what the E is such a prominent part of the 4 chord that it carries over, whereas
Okay.
here the E is not,
Okay.
even if it's a 9th, that's really close to a non-chord tone, And so I would have trouble calling that a suspension. It's really a dissonance. But again, if you said this is 5/9 and then had both of these as suspensions, I would accept that as an interpretation. And then the rest of this is actually like, this is like this, this is like this, this is like this. So let's just go on to the next piece. Turn over on the back.